We were told the FBI was on its way and it would be a couple hours. And of course, they never came.
But retired FBI agent Ron Walker says the FBI is called in.
In fact, called in immediately. At police headquarters, Larry Mason got a page from the crime scene. "Ron, we don't have a kidnapping," he told Agent Warder. "It's a homicide. Do you want to go?" "Of course," Walker answered. Walker knew that finding JonBenet's body in her own home meant there had probably never been a kidnapping.
For the first time, Ron Walker explains what happened.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
It all started with the police and what they did after they walked through the door to the Ramsey house on December 26th, 1996.
Was the family interviewed after the body was found?
Were we interviewing John and Patsy? No, we weren't. That would have been totally unreasonable at that point in time.
It's really a myth that the Boulder police botched the investigation. It's a myth because at the end of the day, after a 13-month grand jury investigation, starting on September 15, 1998, and ending on October 13, 1999, the grand jury were persuaded, one way or the other, they were persuaded by the evidence. They accepted one theory and rejected another. So in terms of the grand jury, you can't say they weren't able to make a decision or that the case was compromised because the Boulder police botched the investigation, because they were able to reach a decision. But that's not to say there weren't problems with the police or that there weren't mistakes.
I offered at that point any and all FBI resources that were available to assist the Boulder police in their investigation. And that offer was declined.
Now remember, that offer was declined after Agent Ron Walker accessed the crime scene, walked down into the basement, saw Patsy in the lounge with her hands over her face. But before we get to the rest of this analysis, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, it has been an absolute nightmare for some reason trying to make this video. I actually lost over 2 hours worth of research and work, and so I had to literally start all over and do it all over again. So if you can find it in your hearts to be really thankful for this particular post, I'd appreciate it. I mean, you can really do the same thing Chris Flanagan did. Thanks very much, Chris, for your contribution. By the way, this is my reaction to a lot of the comments I'm seeing on the Lucy Letby video. It's actually incredible. People saying things like there was no evidence in a 10-month trial with 14 charges. But no, there was no evidence. Wow. Anyway, if you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please do hit the thanks button and let's get started. So what I want to do in this analysis is illustrate how the investigation wasn't derailed because of a lack of trying, because of a lack of experience, all the things you typically hear, or because of a lack of knowledge or procedures or protocols. Were the Boulder PD just simply clueless? They just didn't know what to do at certain points in time. Well, I think the story you never hear is how the Ramseys set the pace, starting with Patsy's 911 call, where she also literally cut off the call when it suited her. Remember that? Now think about this idea of the Ramseys setting the pace, not the police, where they referred the cops to the ransom note without apparently reading it or touching it themselves. Think about the ransom note also setting the pace. Well, who wrote the ransom note? So who's setting the pace, the tone of the investigation, where they pointed out potential suspects while they remained apparently above suspicion? Look at the housekeeper. Look at this employee access graphics. Look at all of those people. Don't look at us. Where they didn't condescend to be interviewed, especially Patsy was off limits one moment, the next they both appear on CNN. More specifically, I want us to look at how the Ramseys set the pace on day one, basically in the period after the kidnapping phase to the end of the day, basically from about 1:30 till the end of December 26th. And one should ask, was this a failure of protocols or the Ramseys basically not cooperating, or both? And I think we need to keep in the back of our minds the narrative that made sense and stuck at the time. Do you remember what it was? And where is that narrative today, almost 30 years later? And that narrative was that after Arndt's 911 call, John Ramsey told the detective that no one knew about the wine cellar in the basement. That's a really interesting point. That's a very interesting concession. How would an intruder, some kind of pedophile that had just attended the pageants, how would he know about the secret basement? And so he said, therefore, his daughter's murder has to be an inside job. What happened to that narrative? And wasn't it an inside job? Why did that make sense then, but not now?
Was the family interviewed after the body was found?
Were we interviewing John and Patsy? No, we wouldn't. We weren't. That would have been totally unreasonable at that point in time.
We were told the FBI was on its way and it would be a couple hours. And of course, they never came.
I offered at that point any and all FBI resources that were available to assist the Boulder Police in their investigation.
Although the Boulder police called the FBI back into the case the next day, fatal mistakes are made during those first crucial 24 hours. Neighbors aren't questioned. Searches aren't done.
Now, to reiterate what I said about the Boulder grand jury, that went on for 13 months. This is a grand jury trial. It's not a regular trial. A lot of regular trials can be concluded within 1 month. And, it wasn't as if a huge effort wasn't made to push the intruder theory during this whole Boulder grand jury trial. It wasn't solely a presentation from the prosecution's perspective. Lou Smith testified, which was highly irregular. He'd actually quit by then. He wasn't really even part of the whole thing, same as Steve Thomas. And yet Lou Smith testified. I don't think Steve Thomas did. Did Ron Walker testify before the grand jury? Not to my knowledge. And yet another FBI agent did, John Douglas. Of course, John Douglas was part of Team Ramsey, and he testified on April 26 and April 27, 1999. Several handwriting experts for the defense also testified. And do you think that they were able to convince the grand jury that Patsy didn't write the note? And as far as I know, the grand jury rejected all of this. The expertise of Lou Smith, the expertise of John Douglas, the expertise of the handwriting experts. They comprehensively rejected all of this from these heavy hitters for the intruder theory. And this was despite the absence of Walker and Thomas. And so the grand jury got the result. So how was the police side of the investigation mishandled? If anything, isn't the mishandling from the DA's office, not just Alex Hunter's, but Mary Lacey's as well? Mishandling might be the wrong word, just botching it, I guess. Remember, Mary Lacey thought John Mark Carr committed the crime and had him extradited from Thailand with basically no evidence. Talk about a wild goose chase, one of the wildest ever seen in true crime. And yet the story, repeated ad nauseum, is that the police botched the case. No, they didn't. Obviously, the police case wasn't flawless. There were mistakes. There were problems, as you have in all investigations. But I really don't think you can basically say the reason this case isn't solved today is because of the police. So what really happened? Well, let's go to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. Larry Mason knew there was no time to lose in clearing the house, securing the crime scene, and getting a search warrant. Do you get any sense that he doesn't know what he's doing, or he doesn't know what to do, or there's a lack of urgency? Mason decided he would move the Ramseys and their friends to the Holiday Inn at 28th and Baseline. Now, what do you think about that idea? He's going to move the Ramseys to the Holiday Inn, and basically that's where they're going to be sort of looked at and supervised and spoken to. And Yari says he wanted everyone in separate rooms so that he could interview them independently, probably at this Holiday Inn. And so what did the Ramseys feel about this? You sort of get the idea that John, when he talks about this, only found out afterwards what the police procedure was. And yet here is Larry Mason at the crime scene. and this is what he wants to happen. And what is John doing? Is John saying, let me know what you want to do and then let's do it? In the study, however, another detective overheard John Ramsey talking on the phone to his private pilot. He was making plans to fly somewhere before nightfall that same day, December 26th. Moments later, Ramsey told Mason that he, his wife, and his son would be flying to Atlanta that evening. He said he had something really important to attend to. At first, Mason thought that Ramsey was planning to leave the country. You can't leave, Mason told him. We have a lot of unfinished business here. We have to talk to you. John said, okay, and he didn't protest. You're going to have to postpone that kind of stuff, Mason added. You can't go. Do you notice once again how the Ramseys are sort of setting the pace, or at least trying to set the pace? Here's another excerpt from Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. Mason had never once seen a father as callous as Ramsey appeared to be. These are the words of Lawrence Schiller, writing in his book, but regarding his assessment, or certainly what Mason seemed to be saying about the situation. His impression of John was that he seemed, as a father in the situation, he seemed to be callous, which is someone who seems to show no emotion or lack of emotion. Do you think he was right, or do you think this is just subjectivity? Still, the detective tried to withhold his judgment. He knew he might be projecting his own emotions onto the situation. So you get a sense that people have their perceptions, they have their impressions, but they're trying to kind of second guess them. They're trying to be open to other possibilities. And so you're saying, he didn't know how he might act if he was in Ramsey's place. Ramsey then told Mason that he and Patsy wouldn't go to the Holiday Inn. It's quite interesting where he says, okay, I'm not allowed to fly out of here. Okay, he didn't protest, but in a way he did protest, because when he was told to go to the Holiday Inn, when he was actually asked to do something, he basically said, we're not going to go to the Holiday Inn. We're going to go to our friends. We will decide. We will set the pace. In fairness, Mason's impression was that John didn't seem defensive or adversarial, just stoic, resigned almost. His family would go to the home of their friends, the Fernies, and then he said, just give us a day. We just lost our child, give us a day. Do you see how the Ramseys set the pace? So how can you blame the police in the situation? And think about it from the police's perspective. This was tempting to accept, just give us a day, because it was Christmas, Boulder PD needed to organize their staff. There were some people who weren't in the office. So it kind of made sense to bring those people in and get up to speed. Except that the one day turned into 4 months, and the Ramseys would only finally sit down, not on December 27th, but on April 27th, 1997. Was that also the Boulder police botching the investigation, the fact that it took so long to speak to the Ramseys? Did the Boulder police not want to talk to the Ramseys?
I don't think it was personal. I think it was just that they decided that the parents had done it, and then the longer they stayed on that course, the harder it was for them to back up and say, gee, maybe we should look somewhere else.
Sounds fair, doesn't it, especially in hindsight? But the reality is, on that first day, they were looking at someone else. The housekeeper, on that day, on December 26th. They did interview the housekeeper and her family. And on other days, they interviewed people at Access Graphics, and they interviewed the Whites. They were looking at someone else. In the period where the police couldn't, for whatever reason, speak to the Ramseys, they were speaking to a lot of other people. It wasn't that they were just waiting to speak to the Ramseys. But once again, do you see how the Ramseys were setting the pace? And when Patsy says, I don't think it was personal, I'm not sure if the housekeeper felt the same way. Being falsely accused of murder feels extremely personal, I'd say. Now consider where we are today with the inside job narrative. Would you say the mainstream media narrative, John's narrative, and the Netflix narrative still pushes an inside job narrative, someone who was close to the Ramseys who committed this crime? I don't think that's so far-fetched. I think that is quite plausible. So why has that idea, or the idea of that, fallen out of the mainstream narrative?
Hiding in the house. He waits until the Ramseys come home. They go to bed early. The children on the second floor, the Ramseys on the third. The belief is, while it's an easy house to get into, the intruder came through this basement window.
Let's start over, shall we?
The belief is, while it's an easy house to get into, the intruder came through this basement window.
Did you catch that? It's an easy house to get into, but the intruder somehow decides to make life very difficult for himself, and he goes down the grate and then tries to get through the basement window. Well, there are other windows right there. Why not break one of those windows? And let's play this again in slow motion. And what do you notice about the basement window from this particular angle? Let's look at it again. Well, what you should notice is look at all the windows, look at all the viewpoints that look out over this basement area, which means someone in the lounge, someone upstairs, someone in the sort of kitchen area. All of these people, all of these windows provide possible points of view to someone either coming in or coming out that particular area. It's not a very good place to try and break in, or for that matter, break out. Anyway, let's return to the timeline to piece together what really happened that afternoon and evening. By 1:50 p.m., this is basically 20 minutes after JonBenet was found and the police were on scene. 20 minutes later, the house was secured. 40 minutes after that, Detective Arndt went to see the Ramseys at the Fernie's house, so that's already following up and trying to do something. It's not like the police just passively were like, okay, we'll just leave you guys and whatever. They were actually still trying to do their jobs. Meanwhile, Detective Patterson went to the White's house to speak with JonBenet's 9-year-old brother Burke. That's a really important step that was taken there. And Detective Patterson is another of the peripheral figures we need to look at. But Patterson was confirmed what he'd been told earlier, that the boy had simply slept through the events of the previous night. Nothing really was revealed to that. Now, at least Burke was interviewed separately. And did you know that Burke was the only one of the Ramseys' inner circle, in terms of the nuclear family, who testified before the grand jury? Because John and Patsy didn't. And it was actually about them. In hindsight, the grand jury, that trial was really about them. And did you know that Doug Stein, Burke's best friend, also testified to the grand jury? Now consider the fact that the parents, which would form the center of the focus of the grand jury's attention, weren't interviewed at the time. And you would actually think that the grand jury would be thinking the same thing. Why weren't they interviewed at the time? I wish they were interviewed at the time. What do we know about the interviews at the time? And this wasn't for lack of trying, as you've just seen. And it wasn't because the cops didn't know that that was what they were supposed to do. I mean, the one person who absolutely knew this, knew it was procedure, knew it was protocol, besides Larry Mason, was FBI agent Ron Walker, and he was on the scene. He was there.
Walker says the parents should have been interviewed.
The parents or the folks that are going to be interviewed have to be made to understood that although this is a very traumatic event for them to have been involved, they have to try to put a little bit of that aside and sit down, if just briefly, and try to recount the events as they recall them to the investigator.
Now, I can hear the argument where you might say, but surely the Ramseys did speak briefly to the police here and there. Perhaps they gave them samples of their handwriting, and John gave them, I think, his camera and pointed them this way and that way, and surely these interactions were sufficient. But that's not what the agent's talking about. The agent is talking about, tell us briefly your movements, what you were doing, when, what happened when you woke up, etc. And were any of these statements made by John? Were any of these statements made by Patsy? And I can guarantee you, if they were made, they would be part of some report. And are they part of some report? I'm talking about a report made on the 26th or the 27th or the 28th. And you can't say, again, that if you don't talk about that, well, it's okay, you spoke about other things. That is the kind of information they want to know, which is, what is your version of what you were doing when these incidents happened? What do you remember from that night? And you can imagine, just in a very basic way, why do you want to wait 4 months to get that version of events? Because that's exactly when someone can say, oh, it's 4 months ago, I can't remember. That's what you want to avoid.
Kidnappers leave ransom notes. I can't fathom a reason of why an individual like that would leave a ransom note, unless the intent ultimately was also to remove the victim from the location and demand a ransom for that person. But that is not something that, in my experience, is very prevalent.
How many kidnapping cases do you know of where the person isn't kidnapped and there's a ransom note and the ransom isn't claimed, and there doesn't seem to be anyone who calls to claim? So what was the point of the whole thing to begin with? So again, what really happened? Well, the police are blamed for not interviewing the Ramseys, but I think the reason they held back, think about this, was out of compassion. What's strange is that if they did so because this was everything to do with JonBenet, and we don't show pictures of JonBenet lying on that carpet, but they do exist, and that did happen. And you can imagine that pulled on their heartstrings, especially of Linda Arndt. And if they held back out of sympathy, what's quite interesting is some observed that at least one of the parents didn't seem as affected by events as they perhaps could have been. And maybe that is just down to people are different. But, if the ransom note was a contrivance, think about the compassion of the cops versus whoever authored the ransom note, and that person perhaps putting all their compassion and grief and so on aside and coming up with this contrivance. I mean, obviously, if you consider that as a potential scenario, and you might say that's why that scenario doesn't make sense, because no one could do that. No one could put that emotion aside. But then I think another question is, what if someone could? What if someone did? What does that say about that person? Of course, subjectivity isn't an exact science. Back to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. Mason consulted Arndt, who felt that every consideration should be weighed, and then Ella. Everyone was still reluctant to push the parents. So you kind of get a sense that all of the police feel kind of bad about the situation, which is different to what Patsy's just communicated, where she says they just suspected us and weren't willing to think about anything else. You kind of get a sense that they were well-behaved and well-meaning, don't you? And besides this, actions speak louder than words, because the police did wait to talk to the parents. Now, if you return to the timeline, we see that by 1:50 the house was secured. 40 minutes later, Detective Arndt went to see the Ramseys at the Fernie's house, and we'll deal with that. She also went to them again much later that evening, and we'll deal with that. But then also Detective Patterson went to the White's house and spoke to Burke Ramsey. And this is the report that emerged out of that interaction. And we'll deal with that in the next episode. Well, I'm not going to take it further than that. I must say this was a horrible piece to rewrite out. The original was far better, far fresher, far more on point than this one. But if you've appreciated this analysis, as I say, please do hit the thanks button and look out for part 3 in this ongoing analysis dealing with specifically Ron Walker as this peripheral figure and his contribution to this case. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.